Hi guys, today our session is respiratory physiology. In this session, we are going to talk about how do we breathe and why do we breathe. Basically, we are going to talk about the gas exchange mechanisms here. Talking about respiration, what are the functions of respiratory system? Main functions of respiratory systems are it supplies the body with oxygen and disposes of carbon dioxide. And it also filters the inspired air. And it also produces sound. Respiratory system also here for the phonation. Okay. And it clears body from excess water and heat. And it also controls blood pH. Though there are many functions of respiratory system, main primary function of respiratory system is to obtain oxygen for use by body cells and eliminate carbon dioxide that is produced by the cells. So, what is breathing? Basically, breathing is pulmonary ventilation. So, it is consist of two cyclic phases. It is consist of inspiration and expiration. Inspiration is the process of gas come into the air, come into the lungs. And expiration is the forces gases out of the lungs. Okay, gas coming into the lung is inspiration. Gas goes out of the lungs is expiration. So, what are the respiratory events? Pulmonary ventilation. So, the exchange of gas between the lungs and atmosphere is the pulmonary ventilation. The exchange of gas between alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries is the external expiration. And exchange of gases between systemic capillaries and tissue cells is the internal respiration. So, pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, internal expiration, these are all some of the respiratory events. So, in expiration, diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax. And in inspiration, diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract and it increases space of the thoracic cavity. So, this inspiration, it's a very active process. And we mean by active process, it requires energy. And diaphragm contracts, and at that process, diaphragm contracts and moving downward and flattening. So, it will increase the volume of the chest. Okay. In expiration, it is a passive process. And it takes the advantage of the recoil properties of elastic fiber. So, the diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax. So, the thoracic cage will return to their normal size and shape. And these two processes happens when phrenic nerve stimulates. Phrenic nerve is the one supplies the stimulation for these processes. So when we talk about lung, we have to talk about lung volumes. Okay. Minute ventilation is the breath counts per minute. We take this graph and talk about. Okay. Here. Tidal volume. Tidal volume is the volume inspired or expired with each normal breath. It is usually about 500 milliliters. What is the inspiratory reserve volume? It is the maximum volume that can be inspired over the inspiration of a tidal volume. And what is expiratory reserve volume? So it is the opposite of inspiratory reserve volume, maximum volume that can be expired after expiration of a tidal volume. So what is residual volume? It is the volume that remains in the lungs after a maximum expiration. So residual volume and expiratory reserve volume combines and form the functional residual capacity. Okay. And inspiratory capacity is the sum of tidal volume and the inspiratory reserve volume. Okay, this is inspiratory capacity. It is the sum of tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume. And vital capacity. What is vital capacity? It is the sum of inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume, and the residual volume. Sorry, residual volume is not included. Only for vital capacity, the sum of inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and expiratory reserve volume is included. These values, when combined, it forms the total lung capacity. Usually, total lung capacity is it is more than value is more than in males than in females. Okay. So basically, the gas exchange process in the body is called respiration. And when we talk about that respiration process, it has three basic steps. They are pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, and internal respiration. In the previous slide also it mentioned, in pulmonary ventilation, it involves the exchange of air between atmosphere and the alveoli. And external respiration, it will involve the gas exchange process between the lungs and the pulmonary capillaries. And in internal respiration, it is exchange of gas between the blood in systemic capillaries and tissue cells. So in this step, blood loses their oxygen and gains carbon dioxide. So breathing in is called inhalation, inspiration. Each inhalation, the air pressure inside the lungs is equal to the air pressure of the atmosphere, which is usually about 760 mercury millimeters. So air flow to the lungs, the pressure inside alveoli must become lower than the atmosphere pressure, because pressure comes from the higher pressure to the lower pressure side. So this condition is achieved by increasing the size of the lungs. When the size increases, pressure decreases in the lung. So there is pressure gradient and air flows from the atmosphere into the lungs. In the opposite mechanism, breathing out, exhalation starts when the inspiratory muscles relax. When diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax, exhalation begins. So for exhalation, pressure in the lungs should be greater than the pressure of the atmosphere. So normal expiration during quiet breath. So it is, as we talked about earlier, it is a passive process and no muscle contractions are involved. So as I told you previously, for expiration, the normal elastic recoil of the muscles are used. So these two involved directed forces contribute to elastic recoil are the recoil of elastic fibers that was stretched during inhalation, and also the inward pull of surface tension due to the film of alveolar fluid. So in external respiration or pulmonary gas exchange, so it is the diffusion of oxygen from air in the alveoli of the lungs to blood in the blood in the pulmonary capillaries, and the diffusion of carbon dioxide in the opposite direction. In external respiration in the lungs, it converts deoxygenated blood, which coming from the right side of the heart, into the oxygenated blood that returns to the left side of the heart. Okay. As blood flows through the pulmonary capillaries, it usually picks up oxygen from the alveolar air and unloads carbon dioxide into the alveolar air. So this is like it is happening exchanging of gas. So this process is carried by diffusion. In internal respiration, so the left ventricle pumps oxygenated blood into aorta and through the systemic arteries to the systemic capillaries. We talk about this process in cardiac cycle, and the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between systemic capillaries And tissue is called internal respiration, or this is called systemic gas exchange. So how do we transport oxygen? So usually oxygen does not dissolve easily in water. It's only about 1.5% of inhaled oxygen is usually dissolved in blood plasma, which is usually mostly water. About 98.5 oxygen is bound to hemoglobin in red blood cells. Okay. So in biochemistry sessions, I think you have learned about the molecular structure of the hemoglobin. So under that, hemoglobin molecule can bind into four molecules of oxygen. Okay. And as blood flows through tissue capillaries, the iron-oxygen reaction reverses. So the hemoglobin releases oxygen, which diffuses into the interstitial fluid, and then it goes to the cells. So what are the factors that affect affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen? Although partial pressure of oxygen is the most important factor that determine the percentage of oxygen saturation of hemoglobin, there are other main factors which decide the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. The acidity, means the pH level, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, temperature, and 2,3 glycerate level. So what is acidity? When the acidity increases, when the pH decreases, the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen decreases, and oxygen dissociates more readily from the hemoglobin. Okay. So this is illustrated in graph. In this graph, in biochemistry, you will learn more about the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve and the structure of hemoglobin and their binding capacity. Okay. So the other factor is partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So when carbon dioxide enters the blood, it is temporarily converted to carbonic acid. So it dissociated and form hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So in red blood cells, the H plus concentration increases. So when the acidity increases, the pH decreases. Okay. So in increased carbon dioxide produces a more acidic environment. So which help release of oxygen from the hemoglobin. Okay. We also add a simple graph to understand better. Okay. This is the normal blood PaCO2. When the high blood partial pressure of carbon dioxide, there is increased release of oxygen from hemoglobin. Okay. The other factor is temperature. Usually, it is a byproduct of metabolic reaction of all cells. And the heat released by contracting muscle fibers tend to raise body temperature. And when the cells are metabolically active, they require more oxygen, and they generate more acid and more heat. So in this graph also, I have added how the temperature affect. So 2,3 glycerate. So BPG is formed in red blood cells when they break down glucose to produce ATP. This is the process which is called glycolysis. So when BPG combines with hemoglobin, it unloads or decreases the bonding with oxygen. Okay. So we talk about how oxygen transport and what are the factors that determine the affinity of oxygen. So how do carbon dioxide transport in the blood? Okay. Carbon dioxide can transport dissolved carbon dioxide. About 70%, or smallest percentage can dissolve in blood plasma. And on reaching into the lungs, This dissolved carbon dioxide diffuses into alveolar air and it is then exhaled. And also carboamino compounds. About 23% of carbon dioxide combines with the amino groups in the amino acid proteins in the blood to form carboamino compounds. And these compounds transport the carbon dioxide. And bicarbonate ion. This is the greatest percentage of carbon dioxide. About 70% is transported in blood, as well as bicarbonate ions. So this is the carbon dioxide dissociation curve. I just had a small diagram. This is a summary of what we discussed. Okay. So how do we regulate the respiration process? Regulation is of respiration control, and it is usually we have to change the rate and depth of respiration as per the physiological demand. So control of respiration usually primarily involve neurons in the reticular formation of medulla and pons, because the medulla sets the respiratory rhythm. Okay. The purpose of why do we have to regulate the respiration? We have to maintain a constant oxygen and carbon dioxide level in blood. And we have to adjust the oxygen supply as per the metabolic demand of the body. And also it helps to regulate acid-base balance of pH. So, as we talked about previously, the size of thorax is altered by the action of the respiratory muscles. As we talked about the phrenic nerve, which transmit impulses, and they transmit impulses from the centers in brain, and they relax in the absence of those nerve impulses. These impulses travel through phrenic and intercostal nerves. Okay, phrenic nerve to the diaphragm and intercostal nerves to the external intercostal muscles. So these nerve impulses are sent from clusters of neurons located bilaterally in the medulla oblongata and pons of the brainstem. So this widely spread neuron cluster is called respiratory center. So this area is called the respiratory center. So, what is the mechanism of regulation of respiration? There are two major mechanisms to regulate the respiration. There is nervous regulation and chemical regulation. So, what is the neuronal regulation of respiration? It's usually by the respiratory center. The respiratory centers are divided into four major groups. Two groups are located in medulla and two groups are located in the pons. Okay. The two groups are located in the medulla are dorsal respiratory group and dorsal respiratory group and the ventral respiratory group. These are located in the medulla. So the two groups in pons, the pneumotaxic center and apneustic center. So both of these are known as pontine respiratory group. And also we can divide respiratory centers based on their functions into three areas. They are the medullary rhythmicity area in the medulla oblongata and the pneumotaxic area in the pons and the apneustic area which is also in the pons. Pneumotaxic and apneustic area which is located in pons and medullary rhythmicity area which is located in the medulla oblongata. Medullary rhythmicity area. So the function of this area is to control the basic rhythm of respiration. So it includes two areas. They are inspiratory area and expiratory area. In inspiratory area, this area, it establishes the basic rhythm of breathing. So when the inspiratory neurons fire, a burst of impulses travel along the phrenic and intercostal nerves. So they excite the diaphragm and external intercostal muscle, and with the stimulation, they contract. Okay. The expiratory center, in the expiratory center, it forms the impulses of the expiratory area, cause the contraction of internal intercostal muscle and abdominal muscle. So they decrease the size of thoracic cavity and cause forceful exhalation. So pneumotaxic area. So this area transmits inhibitory impulses to the inspiratory area. So the major effect of these nerve impulses is to help to turn off this inspiratory area before the lungs become too full of air. And the apneustic area, this area sends stimulatory impulses to the inspiratory area that activate and prolong inhalation. The result is a long, deep inhalation. So we talk about the nervous regulation. So in here we talk about the nervous regulation of the respiration. So now we are going to talk about chemical regulation. So there are three important chemical factors which control the respiration. They are concentration of carbon dioxide in blood, concentration of H plus ions or pH, and the